like the dog version of a cat. He loves, I mean, yeah, no end of like petting or anything. So, so
That's
thank
dope.
yeah, sorry for last week, and but yeah, I'm glad we can do this. So, and Chris, I haven't met. I'm Adrian.
Hi, Adrian. Good to meet you officially.
Good to meet you too. Yeah,
Heard a lot of great things about you.
oh, that's very nice. So yeah, how are things? So you still working on consciousness stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm still working through the second part of consciousness right now on perception. I need to be more diligent about reading so I can make more progress a little bit faster.
Yeah.
But
that's okay. I mean, it's very slow.
It is, yeah. Rereading sentences.
Yeah. It's dense.
Yeah, when Esteban and I first talked, I mean, I thought if we could work through consciousness and self-consciousness, that would be probably a pretty successful engagement with Hegel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, it's slow going. So we're kind of working on perception and then maybe a little bit of force and understanding.
Mm-hmm. And I don't think we didn't really talk too much about Sensuous-Certainty last time. I think last time we mostly talked about sort of some generalities like the introduction, talked a little bit about the dialectic and some of Hegel's commitments, but we didn't really, we looked at some of the passages in the introduction and sort of talked about Wissenschaft and sort of his notion of how truth reveals itself. And but no, we didn't really get into the nitty gritty of the consciousness portions yet.
Okay.
For sure.
Yeah, this is, I mean, I think the instruction is really fascinating in the idea that kind of like we're not in science, like we don't have a scientific grasp of the absolute, as he calls it. Mm-hmm. But so he makes this claim, and you know, since some of you have been through contemporary phenomenology more recently, there is a little bit of like resonance here. It's like that Heideggerian thought, well, you know, like we want to get at the truth of being, but if we begin with everyday consciousness, we'll get there. And I think there's a bit of that resonance with Hegel that, yes, everyday consciousness isn't yet the scientific grasp of the absolute, and yet it's not that. It's kind of like, you know, it's like a deficient form of, you know, everything is science and everything is truth. So even when you're kind of far from science and truth, you're still in science and truth. And I find that's a really fascinating idea. So there's a kind of like stasis in the dialectic. You're never getting anywhere. It's always like you're always home.
Yeah.
But you're like, you kind of don't know you're home or something. I don't know if that's a little bit metaphorical there. But this kind of, I love that line about despair, you know, that that the dialectic moves by despair.
Yeah, right. The path of doubt and the path of despair.
Right. Yeah. It's really, he calls it an education too. And
what page is that on, Adrian?
I think the despair stuff, I thought it was quite late in the introduction, maybe on like the last. So do you have the numbered paragraphs?
Yes.
Yeah. Are we all roughly working with the Miller, or are you looking at the Pinkard, the new Terry Pinkard one? Is anyone using that new one? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
You are. Does he has the numbered paragraphs though still?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So that's probably the easiest way to refer to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm not sure I'll be able to put my finger on it right away. Yeah, maybe it's in 79 of the introduction. I don't think that's the despair passage. But yeah, in 79, he writes, the necessary progression and interconnection of the forms of unreal consciousness, which is a kind of interesting formulation, will by itself bring to pass the completion of the series. So again, there's like, you know, like we're always already on our way. And in a sense, we're always already there. Mm-hmm. We just don't realize it. And that's something that he talks about as well. I don't know if you noted this. Sorry, I like just jumped in and started talking.
You're good.
But I'll just say one more thing. Like he says, you know, there's like kind of the attitude for consciousness, and then there's our attitude. distinguishes kind of like we philosophers, or we who are reading the text, kind of know better than consciousness, and we're kind of watching consciousness stumble forward, even though the stumbling isn't particularly stumbly, like it's going to go forward naturally and progressively, but it doesn't realize the accomplishments it's making necessarily. Whereas we all along, we see the natural trajectory of this dialectic series.
The Path of Despair portion is 78. It's just before 79.
Oh, 70. Okay, yeah.
But yeah, no, the way I've seen it put is that it's sort of like what Hegel kind of does is he provides this sort of, it's a circular system, like it is self-contained, but it's not viciously circular. Like it's not begging the question. What he does is find sort of the implicit sort of commitments and realities in earlier moments of development, and then makes them explicit in order to attain to what the full sort of meaning of truth and knowledge and subject and substance are.
Yeah. I mean, I think, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the really interesting questions about this text is what exactly is driving the process. And when we read the introduction, it seems pretty natural to put it in terms of skepticism, that there's this want of consciousness to access the truth, and then these realizations, relatively minor realizations, that we're kind of not yet at truth. And so that realization that skeptical realization that what we thought to be true isn't actually true, pushes us forward to a new claim to know. And so it's a kind of, so the one way to read that despair is in terms of like this skeptical awareness of our constant distance from the truth, even though we simultaneously recognize that we're the kind of beings who, if there are beings who can access the truth, we're the kind of beings who can do that. And so it's this, I think that despair is kind of like, knowing that we could know reality, and yet always realizing that we're some, slight distance from it, but that despair presses us on to attain better access, to the truth. And then the other one, which I think PJ probably has talked about maybe, is, Kojève in his lectures on Hegel in the 1940s in France really pushed the idea of desire. And that, so make the master slave or the lordship bondsman, bondsperson kind of section of the dialectic really central. And so that it's not a skeptical progression, that there's something more like actively driving consciousness forward. And I think both readings have some viability to them. So either, again, kind of like as a silly example, but kind of like, when one feels one's loved one is cheating on, you, and you, like, they're weird about their phone, or they don't call back, that kind of skeptical, despairing, like, I'm going to look into it further. You kind of get that reading in some sense. And then this Kojève one is kind of like, no, it's just that like truth kind of insists on itself, and we can never rest until we are one with it or something. And that's that more desire Kojèvian reading of it too.
It reminds me a lot of when we read Heidegger in the 20th century course, that he prefigures this kind of existential mood that gains this momentum, and there's something just innate about our desire to inquire into the object of truth. And it's not, like you said, viciously circular, right? But it's almost, there is this sort of self-evident kind of principle about our own consciousness as like phenomenological observers, and then kind of develops from there and pushes the limitations of these things. So it is weird because I don't see him as defaulting into skepticism. Like, we gain this much in our progression forward, but we still kind of default. But it's like, how much farther can we push beyond that and find more implicit unities, like PJ was saying, within the world around us.
Yeah. Right. Well, it's interesting because we noted, it's interesting what you're saying, Adrian, because we kind of noted, at least I thought, there was generally, at least for modern philosophy, a generally pretty optimistic tone. He has some of these lines in there, mistrusting our mistrust, finding out that our, criticism was the thing to criticize, so there's some of these notes that, you have these despair comments, but then you also have these, notes where, as you said, he's like, well, let's just try and start.
Yeah, right.
Why don't we, this imminent critique, why don't we see how far we get with these various forms of consciousness or these various forms of self-consciousness? And even in the skepticism section, he's pretty clear that it leads to, I think in his mind, anti-rationalism, a kind of, reason pursuing a negation of the world that then falls back into, well, reason actually couldn't get us anywhere, and so ends up kind of collapsing in on itself.
Right.
And so in some sense, he's kind of showing how skepticism, an imminent critique of skepticism, actually doesn't work, doesn't get us any further than where I think he wants to start. So
no, I think that's good. I mean, Hegel is one of the first thinkers to start, pressing against critique, or like the really deep influence that Descartes had on modern philosophy. And so I agree that if it's skeptically driven, it's not like Descartes' first meditation, where it's just kind of like, oh, we know nothing. Like, what in the world could we ever know? Chris, your way of putting it is really good, that it's a kind of imminent critique of skepticism. There's like there's a reflective component to it. It's kind of like when we're aware of not knowing, when we don't know, we're also aware of not knowing. And that's a productive cognitive state. State of consciousness in a way. Then that's more than what Descartes gave us, really.
He has this great line in section 80 in the introduction, where he says, the conceit which understands how to belittle every truth in order to turn back into itself and gloat over its own understanding, which knows how to dissolve every thought and always find the same barren ego instead of any content. So there's this kind of like, skepticism actually doesn't gain any content. It just ends up always falling back into this, great line, barren ego, great line, I think.
It's a great line. And he has this kind of way of referring to the history of philosophy without ever really citing people. And so, like, I take it that reference to the ego is probably Descartes' notion of the cogito. And I think that is one way to read the cogito or the meditations, is that Descartes might restore us to a kind of self-contained consciousness, but that's about it. Like, if you go down that radical skeptical route, you don't get anywhere. I like the Kojevian reading. I'm sympathetic to it. That really what's driving this isn't, it's a kind of skepticism, but this idea of kind of imminent desire that Kojev's really going to pull out of the Bond's person, section of the text, which is quite small, but he makes it really central. And then just one other thing to remember, Hegel really liked Aristotle. He thought Aristotle was, like the other great, the two great philosophers were Kant and Aristotle. And Aristotle at the beginning of the Metaphysics basically just says that, by nature, what we, all persons want to know. Like, it's just what we are as beings is knowing beings. And sometimes when I read Hegel, I just think that he takes that from Aristotle and just thinks, well, what does it mean to be human? Well, humans just want to know. Like, it's inevitable. Like, there's no kind of calming that. There's no, you can break it and you can put up obstacles to it and you can deny it and refuse it. And yet there's just this impulse towards knowing, even though we get knowledge wrong from Hegel's perspective. Like, we've thought of perception as knowledge, or we've thought of understanding as knowledge, where he wants to say there's this other kind of knowledge that we're kind of ignoring. But all along we kind of just want to know. And this is all before psychology. So it's hard not to psychologize this, but if you spend any time around kids and young people, it's kind of true. Like, people just want to know. Like, they're like, what is that? What is that? Like, why does it go that way? And there was no like instruction for someone to look into matters. It just comes from being human. It's just we want to know, and so that's that other Kojevian like impulse, this desire to know. So.
It kind of, he talks about like even this desire to know, it's kind of not just this abstract desire to know, but it has a scientific structure to it, that there is this inquiry and method and object which kind of that presents us with a system to make sense of these things. You know, it's not just kind of like arbitrary, you know, we're projecting kind of classifications onto things and making sense of it, but that there is implicit within the world, you know, ways of like constructing knowledge through consciousness, for consciousness, but, you know, in itself as well.
And that's a really important point to bear in mind, because the language of essential or non-essential, or kind of being for itself and being in itself, one of the great contributions that Hegel makes to the history of epistemology is that we only know the world kind of insofar as it's our world, you know, like, so when we know something, it's not some other thing that isn't us that like, we don't find ourselves in the midst of kind of a belligerent, you know, defiant world. It can seem that way because, again, we have the wrong idea of knowledge. But if we just realize like what knowledge really means, and what truth is, what we'll find is that we are, you know, in the midst of a extensively knowable world, which has a systematic scientific structure to it. And it's a kind of hard, especially going back kind of behind Nietzsche. Once you kind of read Nietzsche, it's hard to kind of
exactly.
And be like,
I was thinking about that.
But I like that, you know, like, I remember once in Atlanta, because a lot of the flora and fauna in Atlanta is quite different than anything I'd ever seen. It's quite tropical, and I'd never lived there before. I'd never lived in the kind of, you know, that kind of environment before. And I remember like looking at these new plants and animals for the first time, lizards everywhere, and, you know, just these kind of tropical plants everywhere. And I found it all quite like humbling, and not humbling, but just like, it just seemed like a new world. Like I was just like, I don't understand. I guess I didn't know the world, you know, like I didn't know it looked like this. I didn't know it sounded like this. I didn't know it smelled like this. And I think we're kind of familiar with that modern, like, you know, just like despair that we don't know the world, that, you know, there are parts of, you know, South Africa, to use Reagan as an example, like, you know, like your time in South Africa, probably like every day felt like you're just like, nope, I didn't know that. You know, I'm ignorant. I'm a white person. Like, I'm just so stupid. Like, and so it's so hard to get back behind that modern experience of like thinking the world is quite foreign and different and inaccessible, to get back to this Hegelian notion that no, in fact, the world is human. Like what other world is there? There's only the human world, you know. If we know it to be, if it is the case, we can know it to be the case. That's the Hegelian kind of insight. And there's a lot of like political consequence of that idea and economic consequence of that idea. But we can set those aside and just think about the epistemology, that the world is eminently knowable for us.
I was going to add, we Esteban and I are reading through the along with the Rutledge companion to the text from Stern, and his kind of intro, he basically argues that Hegel wants to help us feel at home in the world again, you know, and kind of uses this almost like therapeutic view of the phenomenology. Sorry, I've got this thing going off. Technology.
It's always funny. It's always funny to talk about philosophy in Siri's presence, because she always says, "I don't understand."
That's right.
One day she's gonna say she does understand. She's gonna give you a fucking good ass answer.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And because he's you know, so the historical moment here is you know, post Kant, and there are two ways to read Kant. You know, there was the way Kant meant to be read, and that was that, again, we were at home in the world and we could know it, but he thought we had to pay a certain epistemological or metaphysical price to draw that conclusion, that we know the world kind of as it appears to us, but we don't know how it is in and of itself. And that was the kind of Kantian, like, you know, to get us to be at home in the world, we had to sacrifice something like a completely objective access to the world, that we would just never know it kind of minus human perception. But since we're never going to not be human perceivers, that wasn't any cause for alarm for Kant. And then, then I think I've told some, do you know about Heinrich von Kleist, that author, that romantic author? He read Kant the other way. This is a sad moment that a philosopher actually killed somebody. So Kleist was a really great early romantic writer. And he read Kant, this notion that there is a world in and of itself, we just don't have access to it. But we have access to the world as we perceive it, and as we perceive it is as true. So don't worry about what it is in and of itself. That's just an idea anyway. But certain romantics read that as kind of, we are just deeply and heartbreakingly alone. We live in a world that's so foreign to us. And there's that kind of first, like, Kant's weirdly more modern than Hegel in a certain way, because he's like, yeah, the world's strange and we will never know what it's like in and of itself. And so Kleist read Kant that way, and he took, this seems so misogynistic, surprise, surprise. But he and his fiance out onto a bridge, and he shot her in the head, and then he shot himself in the head from reading that passage from Kant, or reading Kant that way, because he's like, well, then what's the point of existence if we're always going to be kind of homeless in this world? But that's not I don't think that's, I don't want to put Kleist's death on Kant's doorstep, in this reading of Kant. But Hegel kind of wants to go that other route, be like, so he runs this really particular gambit, because he wants to say, not only are we at home in the world, there's no thing in itself that we don't have access to. So he takes the kind of Kantian, we know the world as it is, and then goes one step further and says that the way we know it is as it is. There's nothing else. There's no kind of hidden, inaccessible truth beneath appearances, which we'll talk about in the Force and Understanding chapter. So again, it's this kind of it's this one last kind of early modern claim to a deep and, intrinsic systematic knowledge of the world. And then ever after, we just, we lose that, after Hegel.
Yeah, it seems like, especially his critique of, cognition as instrument or cognition as means, he's just saying, like, we don't even need that, we don't even need, there's a symbiosis between world and subject. We don't need this view of cognition that automatically separates us, Yeah.
No, symbiosis is nice. The really hard epistemological challenge he presents to us in really simple terms is to think about the subjectivity of objects and then the objectivity of subjects, and that they are necessarily entangled with one another, that they're not this kind of Cartesian subject who has to get back to objects, and the objective world isn't some kind of like mute, resistant, defiant thing out there that we have to kind of trick into showing itself to us. We are swimming in the water of it at all times. Like we are enmeshed with the world, and that, again, that's a bit different from the history of philosophy, especially after Descartes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think one thing about these other forms of knowledge, like perception, sense certainty, perception, understanding, is that we fail to realize the deep symbiosis between the subjective and objective when we have the wrong cognitive attitude towards it. So when we think in terms of sense certain, just apprehension of the world, of course we're going to find the world like just, we're not going to, it's going to fall apart. It's not going to stick together, we're going to feel lost, but that's just because we're in the wrong kind of cognitive mode. And so we bump up to another cognitive mode that's closer to the kind of deep connection between us and the world. Yeah.
We talked about this earlier, and it's in the first sentence of the introduction, where he says, it is a natural assumption and that in philosophy, before we start to deal with its proper subject matter, the actual cognition of what truly is, one must first of all come to an understanding about cognition. Like this idea that it exposes these assumptions, and unless we get the sort of, what is the language used, cognitive attitude correct, we cannot proceed in making sense of the rest of sense certainty and perception, because we have these a priori sort of commitments to, I don't know, these conceptual contradictions. And if we have that presupposed, then we can move forward with this project of inquiring into the world as it is, in the way consciousness corresponds to reality.
I think back in my first job at the University of Portland in Oregon, one of my colleagues was a Hegel scholar, and we were talking one day, and a little kind of mnemonic he uses, or a little device he uses, I think is really helpful. And so I'll just pass it along. And so like when we construct sentences in English, we construct them with certain kind of subject, direct object kind of, that's how we just formulate our linguistic kind of relationship to the world. But what we don't realize is that, direct object, in the right verb tense, and like an indirect object, all that is guiding us in a certain cognitive way. Like it's structuring our cognition, but it's so like embedded into how we think. I mean, it's below the threshold of thought, because how we articulate our thought just seems to be kind of consistent. Like what we would say is knowledge is how we would talk about my knowledge that, I don't know, plants photosynthesize or something like that. But in that very formulation that plants photosynthesize, I've constructed that in a certain way. It has a certain like form to it. And that form is barring me from access to the truth of plant photosynthesis. So there's this kind of, and I just thought that kind of linguistic, every culture structures its knowledge claims in certain linguistic ways. And those structured linguistic ways actually, they are access to truth, but they're at the same time, like they're just one mode of access to truth. And what he's going to talk about ultimately is a kind of like extra linguistic in that example, a kind of extra linguistic access.
Some good language to use might also be, right, like that the sort of access that we have to these truths are conditioned, but what he wants to get at with the absolute is unconditioned. It's knowledge that just absolutely is true.
Right. Yeah. And because he used the language of unconditioned over and over again. And this actually makes sense of why to begin with sense certainty, because like what is less conditioned than just kind of like blank staring at sense data? Like that does, I mean, it's a really good starting place for exactly that point, that if what we're kind of wanting to access is truth or reality, Wirklichkeit, the actual, like when we are in a state of, and this is too psychological, but when we are in a state of just kind of pure taking in of the world, I mean, aren't we in some sense like in touch with actuality in a very like unmediated fashion? Like just to use that linguistic example again, like someone staring at the green of the yard in Japan is kind of doing the same thing as I'm doing. When I put it in terms of green yard, but just like this kind of like bringing in sense data, this, the qualia kind of thing. And it seems kind of, that's truth. Like what's more true than however we would talk about like sense qualia. Sorry, does that make sense? Kind of,
Maybe this is a helpful way to transition into, I thought, for me at least, like the way he kind of unfolds the example of the here and now as an experiment to see how far we can get with our powers of sense certainty, or the experience of sense certainty.
Right.
And how he kind of concludes a universal principle of the object from that.
Yep.
I'm trying to think what page it starts. But,
Well, I take it that the issue with sense certainty is that, and just to use Chris, your language again of the symbiosis of the subject and the object, in that state of kind of, and I know it more from kind of drug altered states than regular consciousness, but like just kind of just letting it come in basically. In the kind of next moment, you're realizing that you're taking it in, like there's the I pulls away from, like you're aware that you are letting it come in a certain sense. And in that moment, sense certainty is broken, because you're not at one with your sense data
Mhm.
in the very moment of realizing that you are kind of the site of this
Mhm.
qualitative intaking.
Yeah, how do you sense yourself? Like yourself is, it's not something that's present to you, sort of like intuition in the same way, or at least sensible intuition in the same way that those thises and heres are for Hegel.
Right. Yeah.
And I
As
think
soon, oh, go for it.
I think it's interesting too that some of Hegel's concerns are with skepticism, but he also sees Kant as kind of like inheriting. And I think Chris talked about this the first meeting of reading Kant somewhat as a skeptic, whereas nowadays we don't necessarily tend to do that as much.
Mhm.
But like one of his concerns is he thinks that Kant is too settled with what the sort of apperceptive eye is and what it's doing, and he thinks that by like sort of creating not necessarily a methodologically structured sort of deduction of the categories, there he's not really getting at what the I is, what the movement of the concept and into truth is for the subject.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it seems
And-
like here he's kind of like trying to show that a different way, because this is almost like the transcendental aesthetic, right? Where he's kind of like going through and creating like the intuitions of time and space, but he's doing so without trying to postulate any a priori sort of conditions, and more so is just doing this sort of the implicit content of having sort of the experience of an object being present in front of you that you believe yourself to have complete knowledge from.
Right.
So yeah, and an important sense in this too is the way in which like Hegel is taking that third person perspective of consciousness kind of moving through its own contradictions that you brought up earlier.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know.
I agree.
I think-
I mean, Kant is haunting the entire book. Kant just haunts it all through. I mean, as he did for almost the entire 19th century. Kant just lurks in the background. So I agree that where Kant took space and time to be just structurally basic for experience,
Mm-hmm.
that Hegel in some sense is going just down the scale a little bit and just thinking that just pure sensation is even below, like space and time are kind of too far up the ladder. That if we're talking about like the kind of basic aesthetic feature character of experience, it would be in terms of like, I don't know, my elbow in my leg right now, like that I'm leaning on my leg, that like that's where like experience, if we're going to build up a kind of philosophy of experience, or what does he call it, it's at the he calls it it's in 86, but he talks about a kind of philosophy of experience that this transcendental aesthetic should really begin with this sensational level of like pure presence of, again, sense data or sense qualia language we have. Yeah.
And certainly here it seems like he's responding to the empiricist tradition that preceded Kant, and because he argues, doesn't he, that in that sort of tradition the I is sort of treated as though it's an individuated like thing as well, by sort of positing it as self-identity, just like this I that persists and receives sense data, but without really playing any role in forming that sense data or taking that sense data as something.
I mean, Kant read part of the Inquiry, or he read a version of the Inquiry, and then he read some Locke, and so his notion of personal identity and the I comes from his reading of Locke. I actually don't think Hegel read a ton of the empiricists. I think he was reading kind of like the German kind of regurgitations of the British empiricists. But yeah, that Lockean notion that there is kind of the tabula rasa, that Lockean notion that like, the self, even though empty to begin with, because everything is going to be empirically populated into it by way of experience, there is something re-identifiable, kind of self-consistent, that there's an I that persists, through time and through space and through experience. And implicitly, Hegel's charging Kant with just adopting that Lockean notion of personal identity. I don't think that's particularly fair to Kant, but that's
yeah.
I agree with this.
Yeah, I think,
Yeah.
I was just going to add, I mean, one of the interesting things he does here right on the first 2 pages of Sense-Certainty is try to immediately dismantle this idea that Sense-Certainty is as he says at the top of 91, the richest kind of knowledge.
Right.
Indeed, a knowledge of infinite wealth. And it seems to me what he basically is showing that all that Sense-Certainty can give you is merely the claim, this is.
Mm-hmm.
You can only get bare, as he says, sheer being of the thing, slightly down in 91, rather than because the second you move beyond just this is, you're already entering a space away from the immediate, from the determinate, and he basically goes to show this mediation basically immediately happens right after you go beyond this is.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, you can perceive it by trying to point at something, and then that something no longer is the thing that you purported it to be by saying this is a keyboard, and then in the next moment this is a Chipotle burrito bowl. And it's like there's this way in which the movement or the category of the this ends up superseding itself and suspending its sort of previous content. So
right. And as you mentioned already, the second you even say which subject, this I, you're also moving outside of the immediate. You're already moving to a conceptualization of the subject, conceptualization of an I, which then you're already saying I can distinguish my I from another I, so you're already, not able either there to move back into, as the title says, you can't move into my meaning either to try to save Sense-Certainty from mediation.
Right. Yep.
Which I think is fascinating. He says, on the contrary, the certainty is now to be found in the opposite element, in knowing. So basically, if you follow Sense-Certainty all the way out to its conclusion, the subject ends up becoming the essential thing rather than the actual object.
Yeah, and that dynamic of he'll use that over and over again, which is the essential moment in this knowing relationship? Is it the object or is it the subject? And it's a kind of turnstile. It switches from, we presume in Sense-Certainty, we would presume that the essential moment in a sensuous engagement with reality would be the object, because it's just giving off qualia. But then when we realize that we can't kind of parse or specify the qualia that we mean without us parsing it, then it switches and it's us. Just in my example of the green grass, I am the one who specified that it's that green grass that I meant. And so the essentiality shifts from I took it to be the greenness of the grass, but it's my specification of the greenness of the grass that that organizes it. I'll just use a silly example. I mean, have you all had this experience, or is it just me? Have you ever wanted to just be an animal because you kind of wanted to just be at one with the world? My cat, and Reagan can probably add or subtract to this story, but he just seems kind of at home in the world. He doesn't overthink shit. I don't think, it doesn't seem that way. And I think this is Sense-Certainty. Sense-Certainty is that kind of really just, and it's part of our being, I think, in a way we are there's an animality to us, and an objectivity and a minerality and a rockiness and a vegetable nature to us. And so I think we know that there are times when it's just I wish I were just an elk grazing in the meadow, but in the very moment of wishing that we were that, we stop being that, and that's this kind of this human condition, to be conscious. I take it that we are conscious in a way that unfortunately animals are not. And that's not to disparage animals. That's just to say that we are beset with a certain awareness of what we're up to at this reflective or meta level that prompts us, even though we want to be one with the world, it always occasions us to kind of not be one with the world.
Yeah. there's this, and I think that Robert Brandom has a really good way of articulating the distinction between like animal cognition and sapient cognition. And he calls it reliable differential responsive disposition. And so, yeah, basically it's just the notion that like animals or even like inanimate things like thermostats they have a disposition to reliably respond to circumstances that change. So they, whereas we have sort of like conceptually articulated like reasons for behaving in an environment, an animal would only have sort of these sort of sense certainties and sort of dispositions that alter how they might respond to those things. So,
yeah.
Did you all talk about? Sorry, I had to bounce for a second. The Lockean empirical idea that I guess when I was reading this, I was thinking about, like you were saying, like consciousness is always already kind of involved in sort of the process of experience, and so we aren't, at the beginning, consciousness, and it says it nice there on 86, like distinguishes itself from the object, and that process of differentiation is at once to think about consciousness in itself, and then the way that object presents itself to it, and but yeah, like I think about Locke's kind of formulation and the way concepts and ideas emerge are like almost in how do you say, like epiphenomenal thing with that comes after the fact of experience, experience, it's like the primacy of like sense experience, and then concepts and ideas are functional with relation to that, and it seems like Hegel's not is critiquing this idea, like it isn't an epiphenomenal indirect thing, but
so if the empiricist story, it's intuitive and it's quite seductive, and I've hopefully kicked it around in front of you all enough to help you know that it's wrong, but that's that. I mean, and Hegel would say this, like, okay, so you take a bunch of experiences and then you extract something from that, and that extraction somehow correlates with reality. That's the story you're telling me about what a concept is. Like what, like that doesn't make any sense. Like how could like a meta level abstraction from an immediate experience, like then you have to tell a story about how that correlates or corresponds to the thing that you're claiming to know.
Right.
So, one thing that perhaps an analytic philosopher would do would be to just kind of tell better and better empiricist stories. What Hegel wants to do is just say, well, you just have a different notion of a concept. So one complaint about the Miller translation is he translates concept as notion. So that's the one kind of axe that people usually grind against this translation of it. So anytime he says notion, the better translation would be concept. It's Begriff.
And so it's helpful, actually.
So all through, notion is always Begriff. And Griefen in the German, to kind of grasp and to hold, to bring together, this kind of drawing together of like the reins of a horse would be to kind of grip them, So there's something like gathering in the notion of, in the German notion of concept, but it's not gathering in that sense of kind of like, I take my, various kind of sense data, and then I like put them together in a certain way, and then I get this concept out on top of it that I then somehow reapply. Hegel thinks we have the wrong notion of concept, because by and large we work with the wrong notion of knowledge also. So he's really transforming the epistemological landscape pretty radically. But yes, absolutely critiquing that. I've talked about and taught philosophy for many years, and I would say that no philosophical epistemology is more seductive and more subscribed to than the empiricist one. It makes sense. It's kind of like, oh yeah, I saw a bunch of shit, and now I've got an idea of that shit. It's just like, I think if you just stopped anyone on the street and asked them, they'd probably tell you basically that empiricist story. And Hegel's saying that, it's just not, it's just fundamentally wrong, because it has nothing to do with knowledge. It has nothing to do with really knowing the truth. Or sorry, not nothing, but it's a far cry. It's very distant from knowing it.
There's also this need. Go for it, Chris.
Sorry, I was just gonna add I thought his whole it would be maybe too strong to make it an argument from language, but he has this whole section at 97 about, we do not strictly say what in this sense certainty we mean to say. He basically talks about how we utter the universal when we say this or being, but we don't actually envisage that, and I love this line where he's like, but language as we see is the more truthful. Which I thought was an interesting, this reminded me a lot of, I've done some reading in like Wittgenstein and ordinary language philosophy.
Yep.
And there's definitely some, fascinating resonances of some of the, and Hegel in some ways maybe could be a, philosopher of the ordinary, based on kind of some of the stuff we were saying earlier, and just the way in which he kind of dismantles this with the kind of language of right when we start saying these things, we utter something that we actually doesn't correspond to what we envisage, but actually is grounded in, to use Wittgenstein's, or the language game that we're already playing, which I thought was a really fascinating, just kind of actually surprised me when he took that route. But
yeah,
this is an unfortunate feature of being an American, is that Wittgenstein got absorbed into the analytic tradition quite early. And so some of his continental European influences, like Hegel and Spinoza, just got kind of set aside. But Wittgenstein was more schooled in, continental European philosophy than he's made out to be when you study him on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. Absolutely, like, this is Wittgensteinian in really interesting ways.
And that's one of the things that, like, the sort of contemporary analytic Hegelians have been pulling onto, is the sort of resemblances between Hegel's project and Wittgenstein and the pragmatist tradition. So
So I take it that, like, the dialectic that's going on in Sense-Certainty is this, just to kind of schematize something and see if this is how you kind of read it. It's kind of like the consciousness begins with this notion that it's like most certain in just taking in qualia. It thinks the essential feature, the essential pole of that relationship is the object in delivering, in kind of giving itself to us in an unmediated fashion. It's just sitting there giving off sense data, basically, and we take it in. And then in the next moment, we realize it's we who are organizing it. And so we come to realize that we are the essential kind of component, which again could cause a certain despair that, oh, wait, I thought our bedrock was the object. And now I came to realize that no, it's actually our organization of that, or our specification of, that color or that angle or that texture of the object. And so that essential polarity shifts. And then in this, once it's kind of in us, so to speak, once we come to realize that I am the organizer of sense qualia and I'm the designator of them, then I try to articulate, oh, I meant this. I meant this feature of the object. I meant that side of the object. But in using that language of this and that, the kind of surface grammar, it seems like that this seems like the equivalent of a finger, but it's not, because, we can all say this computer. And so there's a universality in the linguistic token that we use, that consciousness uses to stabilize or kind of claim its essential role in Sense-Certainty. So I meant to just point at the thing, but the linguistic pointer, this, is not a pointer of any particular this, it's a pointer at all possible thises. And so I bump up to the universal in that moment. You follow that thought process?
Yeah. He says that neatly on 102.
Okay.
He says the I is merely universal, like now, here, or this in general. I do indeed mean a single I, but I can no more say what I mean in the case of I than I can in the case of now and here. So kind of like you were saying, like these sort of universal components emerge as the interpersonal subjectivities and objects kind of present themselves to us.
Right. Yeah, it's just this kind of, it almost feels like a trick that our most specific language, pronouns like I, like there's nothing more like Adrian, other people share that name, and et cetera, et cetera. It seems like I can really get at myself in saying I, and that in that very moment I realized that it's true of every other human being. Like there's this really like singularity blows up into universality in the very same word. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, and basically, and two, it's like we realize the second we get back to the moment we realize we're an intentional, use the language of intentionality. Right. We realize, oh wait, the second we have an intention of seeing this tree, another intentionality I has the seeing of a house. As he uses that example. So
right.
Second you get back into intentionality and realize, oh, I'm an intending subject. Oh crap, I'm away from the sense experience and universalizing. Yeah.
So I think everyone else was in the 20th century class, so that's something that's important for Brentano and then Husserl, that notion that consciousness has that intentional structure to it, and it, though Hegel never quite uses that language, that's exactly what he's talking about here when you turn your attention to the greenness of the grass rather than the softness of its texture. That's the feature. That's what it is to be conscious, is to kind of shift intentionality. But in that shift, right, you move from one modality of yourself to another. You're now like, you were once a green perceiver, and now you're a kind of soft perceiver, soft grass perceiver.
Yeah.
Doesn't he call it like pointing out, or like kind of this like extracting and differentiating from others?
Yeah, at the end of 107, maybe that's where I had in mind. The pointing out of the now is thus itself the movement which expresses what the now is in truth vis-a-vis a result. It is a plurality of nows all taken together, and the pointing out is the experience of learning that now is actually a universal, because every moment is a now.
Exactly.
Yeah. I do love this. It's one of my favorite lines in philosophy in 109, where he talks about how animals solve the problem of like the object-subject distinction. They just eat the object.
That's so great.
Yeah, it's such a great pithy, like, oh, like, I'm not at home in the world, like, what is object, and then the animal just goes and eats it, just like, I'm not worried about it because I just ate it,
So good.
Yeah, but I mean, and sorry, that's why I kind of talked about that, like, want to be an animal in this section, because I had that passage in 109 in mind, because of this kind of like, it is an animal consciousness that we're talking about, and we are that. I mean, we are also that, and we know about just kind of like putting our hands on the world and like seizing it as ours, and children kind of just take the world into their mouth all of the time, and there's something like there's something like familiar about sense-certainty. We can engage that mode of our consciousness pretty regularly, even though we're
isn't that kind of what he's doing in the desire self-consciousness section? Articulate desire as a way of just consuming an object, seeking to establish oneself as a self, as basically let me just use this object to do so, and interestingly parallel sense-certainty in terms of its location, like the most basic form of either consciousness or self-consciousness.
I mean, if the closed circle, the non-vicious closed circle of the dialectic is true, and I agree with PJ, I think you said this, PJ, right? Then the entirety of the dialectic is contained in every section, that the whole of the dialectic is already in sense-certainty, and then the whole of the dialectic is already in perception. It has to be, because again, like, sense-certainty isn't wrong. There's no like, how could you be wrong? This is human cognition. It's just kind of like an under-revealed version of right. And so if you could just like read it the right way, you would see that it's already there. And so these over and over again, we'll see repetitions, because again, we're not going anywhere. Like, there's no movement here. It's just a kind of refining and clarifying of what we always already knew.
I think, and it kind of elaborates the content of it too, right? So it's like, although we may not be like necessarily going anywhere, we are in some ways sort of gaining more content by refining our determinations of what an object is and what ourselves are, and sort of making these and accruing these new determinations kind of brings in more sort of valences for the dialectic to progress by. And so we kind of, it's interesting because like it's we start to see more relations and sort of ties between the object and ourself and our knowing, and all of these things kind of sprout out and like come to fruition over the course of kind of tarrying with these moments of consciousness.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's like, there isn't more than what we already have in sense certainty. Like, there's not like another object to be found. Like when I look at the greenness of the grass here, it's already there. Like I have it all, but you know, the kind of like, I can determine it further, you know, and just in simplistic terms, I could, if I was a scientist, I might be able to talk about its, you know, cellular structure in a particular way. If I was a landscape person, I would be able to kind of specify which species this is, and you know, like its water capacities and all these kind of things. And those further determinations, it's still just the grass, you know. If I was an artist, I could talk about the kind of different shadings of green and these kind of things. If I had a theory of color, I would fill that out. And so yeah, I'm still lingering, tarrying with the object, but with each successive tarrying, I determine it further, or it becomes more determined, you know, like, because it's already all those things. Like it's not, you know, everything that a scientist or an artist or a landscaper could say about them, it's already true.
Yeah.
It's just like, it has to be unfolded to, you know.
Yeah, there's this, it's almost the sense where the determinations that we're working with, right? Because he talks about the how Aufhebung has to do with this kind of preserving, like putting into stasis, suspending, overcoming.
Right.
So this sort of preservation of the previous determination in the new determination is certainly clear here in this sort of progress from the sort of like different qualities that inhere in an object and the also, and this element of the universality of the also is something that we discover. It's almost like he's making these more sort of like primitive notions of sense certainty more rich, like they're becoming like more richly and densely structured, and we're able to kind of learn more about what's actually going on in our practices, what we're saying when we are sort of perceiving something, and how we relay our information or our conception of that thing. And so there's like a very interesting sense in which, you know, like we may not be getting anywhere new, but where we discover more about what we're already doing, what we already are, and what we also might become. And there's this sort of sense in which by structuring and delving in and getting these richer and richer determinations, we're able to recognize possible futures and possible new selves from these determinations.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So one of the things that kind of draws me to Hegel, and I guess a lot of kind of philosophy, is, you know, the second, you know, you kind of totalize one of these views, you're going to end up with like a deficient, you know, impoverished view of the world. But if you can find a way of including them all together, you end up with just this kind of maximalist, full, vibrant world that isn't deficient when you actually go to its full, you know, end, you know, which, so I think that's something, that kind of fullness aspect of it is really human, you know, exciting, I guess you could say, that just really draws me in.
Yeah, I like this, all these ways of talking. I think it's right to read Hegel this way. I think contemporary psychology, I don't know if you guys talked about this in either of the previous meetings, but I think contemporary psychology, or just developments in psychology, and then the very notion of kind of psychological development, in some sense block us from this Hegelian idea, because, you know, we're so used to the idea that to grow is to change, you know, that young people don't have language and then they attain it, and then, like, you know, then they can, that life is this kind of progressive growth and change, and that psychology kind of gave us that view that, you know, once I didn't know a foreign language, and then I studied it, and then now I know it, and like and that seems like a kind of transformation. But the Hegelian version would be to say something like, well, of course, like you didn't change in learning French or German. You just like you were always already a French and German speaker. You just had to like specify that. You had to determine that in yourself. There's a kind of Aristotelianism to this, that all the things that we might become are things that we all already are. We just haven't like actualized them yet. So if you aspire to be a better cook, you are already a cook. You're the kind of person who makes food. You just like, what you're going to do is you're going to kind of fill out that determination of your being. And then the same is going to go on with the world, that the cook kind of knows better about when to put in salt and when to put in pepper and these kind of things. So there's no kind of growth. It's like clarification or actualization. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I like when he talks in 113, he talks about like this idea like of supersession, or like the kind of dialectical movement of negation isn't one in which, like you said, it terminates something or brings it to a definitive end, but it like brings out what's implicit, and there's a preserving concept as well that unifies all of these sort of dialectical movements.
Right. Yeah, the sense element is still present, but not in the way it was supposed to be, in the position of immediate certainty, not as the singular item that it meant, but as a universal, or as that which we define as a property. Yeah. Supersession, Aufhebung, exhibits its true twofold meaning, which we have seen in the negative. Is it as once negating and preserving? Yep.
Yeah.
It's a really fascinating idea. Yeah. I'm not sure if they're Hegelian psychologists. I think there would be something pretty productive in that notion that, like, you don't have to become something you're not. You just have to kind of become what you are, like further become what you are or something. Because you're already what you are. Just be it,
Would you say Jung is kind of a Hegelian psychologist? I mean, he's got some of these ideas like collective consciousness and primal archetypes, which kind of have some of this idea of like there already are these kind of archetypes within human society that have always been there, that just kind of reiterate and remanifest in the collective consciousness over time. That was one resonance I thought of in terms of psychology.
I knew some Jungians in my days in San Francisco, and one day I was out in the woods with a bunch of Jungians, and I was worried that I had joined a cult.
This is a great story.
I stumbled into a cult by accident, and I just stopped, and I never went back. So I might have some blocks against Jung. But now in retrospect, I'm like, well, a cult. I don't know. Maybe that would have been fun. The Jungian cult in the woods of Northern California.
Sounds tight.
But I think right. That's kind of like, that forms are there implicitly or imminently, and they just come to realization variously. In this text, and that I think this is one thing that's hard to get our head around, is that everything's necessary in this text. So like, I don't know if I've ever, I think the yew, like a certain extract from a yew bush, yew shrub, is actually helpful in certain cancer treatments, or something. I think something along those lines. There's something from a yew bush, which again we don't like. I think that's kind of a British shrubbery. I don't think we see that much. But there's something in the extract from that plant that's helpful to certain pathologies in the human species. So the Hegel version of that would be like, that's always been the case. Like the yew extract was always helpful to that pathology in the human being. It was just for us to discover that. Like it was just like, that wasn't a growth or a change or anything. It was sitting there waiting for us to discover. But that way of putting it is that like we might miss something. Like there's going to be features of reality, determinations of reality that we might not come across. And here in the phenomenology, like there's no possibility of missing something, you know, like, so it's, sorry, the phenomenology ends up being part of his science, but he comes to realize that it isn't the whole science, because there are whole features of like world religion, mythologies, art, you know, primitive archetypes. A lot of stuff isn't here in the text, you know, so like the story he tells here is a kind of enclosed system of necessary determination. But then afterwards he realizes, oh, I have to tell a much bigger story. And so, sorry, the Jungian thing kind of reminds me of that like there are these primitive archetypes that are in the past, and like it takes something to bring them forward. But we're not going to get a lot of that here in the phenomenology. And that's why for him, this was really just a beginning of the scientific system. Sorry if that went off the rails a little bit there.
No, I was going to ask, do you think the kind of typical Aristotelian potentiality actuality language is helpful, or do you think
I was just going to ask that?
That might be a little bit too simplistic for how he wants to?
I think it's useful. I mean, he was very influenced by Aristotle. So yeah, I think the potentiality and the actuality that, right, what's the pithy way of saying this, that the oak tree is always already immanently contained within the acorn. It's just a matter of kind of right conditions. But it's just that, like, it's that last step that here in the phenomenology is missing. Like, there is no way any of this wasn't going to happen. You know, like, so his object, consciousness, and kind of the consciousness of experience is this kind of narrow setting for the phenomenology. And then afterwards he's like, oh wait, I have to tell a much bigger story about science, religion, aesthetics, you know, all of that, because all I told was a kind of enclosed like proto-psychology of consciousness. So yeah, but I think the potentiality, actuality is a good example. Here in the phenomenology, it's just that every potentiality is going to be actualized. There's no possibility that a potentiality won't come to actualization.
So are we saying when consciousness comes into contact with this thing or this individuality and starts to make these relations between actuality into potentiality, is that intrinsic to the thing? Is that what we're saying? Like, I don't know. Does that make sense? Like
it's organic to it.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like, I think when I think of Aristotle, there's this like evolutionary organismal development that goes from the actual from potentiality to actuality. But I'm like, is that Hegel? Is that kind of what he's doing with respect to the this individual thing? Is he trying to get into like the sort of, I don't know, unique structure of the thing and kind of examine the way it develops? Or does he abstract from it and then it's not necessarily intrinsic to the thing? I don't know.
Right. Well, sorry, I'm not sure I quite get the question. Let me try to answer it this way.
Yeah.
He adopts the Kantian perspective that experience is the framework of philosophy. That the only meaningful metaphysics is metaphysics of experience. He thinks that Kant got a lot wrong in telling his metaphysics of experience. And so here in the phenomenology, and then subsequently he's going to drop that. He's going to realize that phenomenology is still too Kantian, that he needs to like reframe the entire phenomenological project and write a true science, which is why, like, that's why we read the preface. I encourage us to read the preface afterwards, because that's where he reflects on this. He's like, oh wait, why did I write a Kantian phenomenology of experience? Like, that's a fine part of an overall systematic science, but that's not the whole of the systematic science. So in terms of like the framework of experience, every potentiality will be actualized. So like, if I'm answering your question, I'm not sure I quite get the question, but like when I say that grass is green, when I'm in a state of sense-certainty, that's just like say low-level cognitive operation, just to use psychological language, I'm just saying kind of like green, 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 grass, grass, grass. That's another way to say that is that objects have properties. That's not a new version of that reality. It's just a different articulation of that reality. So green grass, bumping up to calling it an object with properties, or he talks about like a thing with matters, like the matters of the the kind of features of an object. Those are all like, to say grass is green is to say that the thing has properties. And so it's not like to actualize that potentiality that things have properties can't be missed, because you already had that when you said that the grass was green. But all of that in the framework of experience. Like if I'm thinking about the structured feature of my experience just in the kind of Kantian framework, then every possibility is going to be actualized, because like I'm choosing a well-defined and somewhat narrow perspective for my philosophy, for my phenomenology. Sorry, does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
That's what I was going to add too. Like, it's always an actualization for us.
Right.
So it's not, the Aristotelian language wouldn't include this kind of like reciprocation of it being for our own consciousness, but
for sure,
whether or not it is a property of, tree to grow inherently, organically, or whatever, that's maybe how it appears for us, but that's what's significant,
Right. Right. Yeah. So to use the Aristotelian language of potentiality and actuality, again, there's this, on the subjective side, we have to realize that, just to use that same example of like language learning, like I always had the potential to learn a foreign language, and then like I didn't necessarily have to actualize that. And so that's a feature of philosophy that we're not going to deal with in the context here. Every possibility that is in consciousness is going to become actualized. But again, it's like when sense certainty is just staring at objects, taking in green grass, it's also already taking in objects with properties. It's also already perceiving things with features. It just kind of doesn't realize that yet.
That's very helpful.
Yeah.
I just think when I think of the like classical Aristotelian model, it's like this kind of penetration into the substance, right? Like this, and you get like, you intuit kind of, I don't know, these properties and the way that they develop in this, I don't know, formal way. But like Chris was saying, when you incorporate consciousness in the way it presents itself to us, it brings in this phenomenological dimension that makes it a little bit more dialectical and dynamic.
Yeah. I mean, maybe a way to say this is that, Aristotle had to subscribe to a non-changing world in order to get his kind of philosophy to work. So there was no such thing as change. There's no such thing as like, species didn't come into being and pass out of being. They just kind of realize their being. But obviously Hegel's a bit on from that, and he knows that the world changes. And so he has to be able to tell the story. He wants to tell the same Aristotelian story about how all potentiality is actualized, but in the context of a mortal world where things die, species go extinct, climates change, and these kind of things. And so it's a little bit different in that regard. But that's not like, he's such an interesting thinker because he's like right on the precipice of modernity, and yet he's like really resisting it, because the very natural thing to say is, okay, well, and I think everyone on this Zoom call probably feels this way, that the world is a very scary and uncertain place, and it's constantly changing, and that's the modern condition, is that we are kind of in a state of despair, or if we're Nietzschean, a kind of state of joyous despair, tragic despair at the uncertainty of ourselves and of the world. And yet Hegel want to say, yes, the world changes, it develops. There are some early theories of evolution floating around at the time he's writing, but he wants to say that changeability and mortality and fate, the finitude of the world isn't cause for us not knowing it. That's just kind of feature of our knowing it. And so in the phenomenology, his way of handling that is just to kind of put it in the structure of experience, kind of use the Kantian framework. And so
that's kind of drawing me.
Yeah. So,
Oh, sorry. I was just going to draw attention to a section of the text that kind of draws on some of what you're saying. In 118, at the bottom, he's using, the Kantian language of apprehension, comprehension. This return to consciousness into itself, which is directly mingled with the pure apprehension of the object. For this return into itself has shown itself to be essential to perception, alters the truth. Consciousness once recognizes this aspect as its own and takes responsibility. By doing so, will obtain the true object in its purity. I mean, that's the part that's just so shocking. The true object in its purity is our own alteration of the object in perception.
Good. Yep.
That's what I was trying to say earlier.
Yeah. I mean,
this go for it. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say, like, I know this seems strange to say out loud, but like, how could we ever be wrong about reality? Like, everything we say about it is true. It's just kind of like not fully true or something. Like we couldn't get the world wrong because we are of it and in it, and and the only world that's significant is the one that we are of and in. So that realization that we kind of make the world, and that, there's something to that I find intuitively right. I don't know if, I like that's why I like that earlier portion where he talks about he kind of critiques that Cartesian skepticism, and his consciousness is always conscious of something, like it is at home and it is directed and intended and attaching itself to things, and by attaching itself to things and experiencing them and perceiving them in these new ways can make these various determinations that are real. Right. I mean, just to say something of the moment, since it's an important moment, I think, in American history and hopefully in world history, but this notion of, for lack of a better word, a kind of objective consciousness, and that all human beings know the world. We stall or stop or adopt perspectives that limit us in our knowing of the world, but we all know the world. There's no not the world. I take it that something like some of the politics that are getting affected now in the streets and hopefully in political places is to say that, like, perspectival knowings of the world are actually in themselves important. They're not like, so this kind of like racialized perspective on the world from a Hegelian perspective would be like, it's true that the racial minorities perspective of reality is still true of reality, but what has to happen is it has to kind of get folded up into another non-racialized, non-minoritarian perspective. And what I take it that one of the things that we're pressing back against in a more modern sense against Hegel is to say, no, in itself the kind of Black perspective is valuable. You don't have to, you can linger in it, you can remain with it, and it's not less true because of its deficiency. It's precisely more true because of its perspective. I don't know if that
that is helpful.
So that's one charge against this Hegelian kind of view, that to kind of claim a Latinx perspective, he would say, of course, that's of course a Latinx perspective on family life and education and all that is totally valid and true, but it's not true. What has to happen is you have to kind of overcome the Latinx perspective and attain to this other philosophical perspective, which will include the Latinx perspective.
Right. It preserves it.
It preserves it. Right. There's no. It's not to deny it, but it's just the kind of like, when someone says Black Lives Matter and then someone else says all lives matter, I think that's just kind of a silly way to say this. Is like, I think what we're insisting on, I mean, that's true, of course, all lives do matter also, but the insistence is that no, this perspective matters, and it's valuable in and of itself, and it's not valuable in the context of the all, it's valuable in and of itself. But that kind of move to all lives matter would be the more Hegelian gesture. I don't know, just to say something, current eventy or something.
Yeah. Though I think there could be too. I wonder if there's like you obviously would know better than me, but if there could be a kind of like Hegelian corrective of like, the problem with an all lives matter is that it hasn't sufficiently grasped the historicity of the Black Lives Matter claim,
Right.
Totally.
and so you could almost find at least a way of saying, hey, until the moment one reaches the synthesis, the antithesis has to reconcile the historicity of the thesis. It has to actually understand correctly what's being said. So I wonder, if there could be some way of but I definitely hear what you're saying of this impulse for synthesis, this like urge to reconcile all things, into a one.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think that's right. Is that, and I saw this I think it was in the New York Times or in the Guardian. It said something like, we haven't reckoned with our own history in America. That's what we're doing. Like we're maybe finally beginning to reckon with, the fact that this country was, built on slave labor and on, 200 plus years of minority oppression, and we haven't reckoned with it. And so what we need to do is reckon with it, and that gesture of reckoning and kind of incorporation, that would be Hegelian. And that wouldn't deny it. So that's not to say like we just need to kind of get over the Black perspective. It would be to kind of take the Black perspective finally into American consciousness. Yeah. So I think that's consistent. I mean, it's not, I don't know if that's not Hegel's politics, but I think that would be a Hegelian, a way to talk about this. Yeah. That what we're seeing playing out is not just now. It's not just George Floyd. It's that we've never like dealt with this really, this deep historicity. And it just sits like, to use the Hegelian language, it just sits as this kind of dumb, mute, blank object in our past. And until we incorporate it into ourselves and transform our subjectivity by way of that relationship, that transformed relationship with that object, it will continue. It will continue to damn us, to kind of it will keep us from grasping the truth.
Well
Sorry, say something of the moment, PJ, while you're away.
No, you're good. Yeah, sorry, I had to just step out for AC repair stuff. So.
Well, I actually have to jump off myself.
About time to end it. So
thanks all for
real quick, Adrian, what is the time frame for this course? Are we working still within like 5-8 weeks or something? We were talking about that earlier. Or what is?
I mean, I think it's designated as an 8-week class on Pathway, but
sweet.
I'm fine. I mean, we had the week delay when there was some uncertainty, So
totally.
Yeah, sometime in I think we'll probably want to wrap up sometime in July, because the fall semester will be beginning shortly thereafter. So,
Cool.
Yep.
What should we read for next week? Just self-consciousness?
Yeah, if we can get through if we can at least begin self-consciousness, that'd be great.
Sweet.
Cool.
Thanks, Adrian.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, same time next week.
Guys.
If you want to post anything,
thanks everyone.
Feel free. Trying to keep it lively there. So, yeah. All right. See y'all.
Bye.